Many years ago, when I was a kid taking cello lessons in Montreal, Zara Nelsova came to play with the symphony. I didn't know much about her, except that she'd studied with Casals and that she was well known in Europe. And what's more, she was from Winnipeg. She played her strong suit that night, Ernest Bloch's Cello. This is a lyrical work with a vast sweep, requiring tremendous strength and a real concentration of sound. Nelsova was utterly convincing. After all, she had recorded Cello with the composer conducting. I knew that I was listening to a virtuoso at the top of her form. If hers isn't a household name like Jacqueline Dupre's, for example, it might be because of bad timing, not having good management when she needed it, a couple of rash decisions, or just being a little too nice. It certainly isn't because of the way she played. I visited her in her apartment overlooking Central Park West in Manhattan. Animated and looking decades younger than her years, she poured us cups of coffee at her dining room table and shared her remarkable story.
I have searched since I was a tiny girl. I remember when I was about 9. I dreamt I had gone to a concert. The hall was packed. There was no place for me to sit. So I stood at the back of this packed out hall, which was already darkened, and on the stage was a female figure sitting on a podium, and she was playing the cello. And the sound that I heard coming out of that cello is the sound that I have tried to recreate all my life.
At the turn of the 20th century, thousands of immigrants from Eastern Europe were settling in Western Canada. Many were farmers, drawn by the promise of cheap and bountiful land. Others were musicians, with no intention of ever walking behind a plow. One of them was Gregor Nelson, a flute player from Bobroysk near Minsk in Russia. He and his wife came to Winnipeg in 1910 to seek their fortune. Like everybody, they had a dream. Gregor had been following the careers of the Chernyavsky brothers from Odessa. When they were 6, 7, and 9, respectively, the Chernyavskys played for the Tsar. By 1910, the fame of these musical prodigies had spread throughout the world. When he had children, Gregor wanted them to be just like the Chernyavskys, so he was delighted when 3 daughters were born in rapid succession. He could now replicate the Chernyavskys' feat with girls. He threw himself into their musical education, first Anna on piano, then Ida on violin. Zara could hardly wait for her turn. She wasn't quite 5 when it finally came.
My father awakened me, I remember, at about 5 o'clock in the morning on a bitter winter morning in our Winnipeg home, which was ice cold because we didn't have any heating. Nobody had heating. There was a furnace. The furnace would go out in the night. And he shook me by the shoulder and he said, "I have your cello for you." And I was very excited. And I remember, he said, "Sit on the edge of the bed." And the bedclothes had become displaced. And I remember to this day the cold springs the cold spring on my poor little bare bottom. I was very fortunate. He supervised my practice so much. He was in a theater orchestra because that was how the musicians earned their living. They would get into an orchestra in one of the theaters. There weren't too many in Winnipeg at that time, but he was in a theater called the Orpheum. He would make me sit with him with his flute, because he was a wonderful flute player, and we would start to practice long bows, and he would practice his long tones, and we would see who could hold the bow the longest. And this would go on every single morning for about 15 or 20 minutes until I was about 12. And that was how I developed the control of my sound.
By the time Zara was 6, her father knew she needed a real cello teacher. Gregor didn't have to look any farther than the pit of the Orpheum Theater. The orchestra's cellist was Hungarian-born Dezső Mihalik. In Budapest, Mihalik had studied with David Popper, one of the great cellists of all time. Taking cello lessons from Mihalik was like studying piano with a pupil of Franz Liszt.
I adored him. He was a great musician, played with great warmth, and so excited me when I heard him play. It was inspiring. I just adored him, and my playing improved by leaps and bounds.
Zara progressed quickly and caught up with her older sisters. In keeping with Gregor's plan, they banded together and hit the road. Billed as the Canadian trio, the girls appeared all over Canada. They may not have created a sensation comparable to the Chernyavskys, but a performance at the Manitoba music festivals so impressed the adjudicators, they urged the family to move to London to further the girls' education. Zara's father imagined his daughters studying at the prestigious Royal Academy of Music. Zara was 9, her sisters 11 and 13. In 1928, the family set sail for England, propelled by a grant from the Manitoba Ministry of Education and fueled by their father's ambition.
I remember when we moved to London, although the city of Winnipeg had gotten together and raised money for us to go to England, there was very little money, and we were terribly poor when we got to London. And I remember we lived, all of us, there were 4 children and my parents, in 2 rooms. There were no carpets on the floors, there was no electricity. I didn't go to school during that time, and my father was so determined that the practicing shouldn't stop. So I had to practice in one room with my violinist sister practicing in one corner of the room, and myself in the opposite corner of the room for 6 hours a day, with a 5-minute break at the end of each hour. And that was what taught me my concentration. Without concentration, we can do nothing. And this was fantastic training, but very, very difficult to a small child.
The Nelsons had no money at all. Gregor wasn't working. He spent all his time helping the girls practice. They were overheard practicing by a neighbor who happened to be a music critic. He brought their plight to the attention of a committee of women devoted to helping starving musicians. One of its members was Audrey Melville, an amateur cellist who owned a magnificent Stradivarius cello. Audrey and her Strad would make quite an impact on Zara's life. With a stipend provided by the committee women, the family moved into a small house near Hampstead Heath. The children were finally able to go to school. As she was only 10, Zara was too young to enter the Royal Academy of Music, but she did attend the famed London Cello School, where she studied with its founder, Herbert Whalen.
He had, at that time, I think over 100 students in the school. And some of the most outstanding cellists went to that school to study. One of them was John Barbaroli, who used to be a wonderful cellist before he became a conductor. Laurie Kennedy, who was the first cellist of the BBC Symphony, who was the grandfather of Nigel, the violinist. Colin Hampton of the Griller Quartet. Oh, I could go on and on and on. I still call him William Pleath, who later became one of the outstanding teachers in England. When I was about 10, John Barbaroli wanted to take me to play for Casals. And this was arranged, but Casals was playing a performance at Queen's Hall of the Schumann Concerto. I remember the night before, the morning I was to go and play for him. And of course, I was at that concert. And to this day, I will never forget that performance of the Schumann Concerto that he played. And the next morning, John Barbaroli took me to play for him. He said some very nice things about my playing at the time. I don't remember what now. And of course, I was much too young to go and leave my family to study with him. That was what my father had sort of hoped. But it wasn't until war was over that I went to Prague to study with him. Then when I was 12 in London, I made my debut with the London Symphony with Malcolm Sargent doing the Lalo. And I remember practicing, preparing for that performance, and realizing that my concentration was so much better if I could close my eyes. And I believe that's the way I played. And I've played many times with the Berlin Philharmonic, but never with Karajan. I thought, wouldn't that have been interesting, because he conducted with his eyes closed and I play with my eyes closed. How would we ever have gotten together?
Early on, Zara developed a commanding stage presence. She would sweep onto the stage trailing a flowing gown. She'd play with her eyes closed and assume a regal bearing, like that of the Portuguese cellist Madame Suja in the famous portrait by Augustus John. In addition to her solo work, Zara and her sisters performed as the Canadian trio throughout the 30s. They enjoyed a modest success, but were never to achieve the fame of the Chernyavsky brothers. Between 1934 and 36, the sisters endured a grueling year-and-a-half-long tour of Australia, North Africa, and South Africa. The stress of the tour wore the girls down. It had a profound effect on Gregor, too. He abandoned his dream, and his girls. He'd fallen in love with Australia.
It wasn't until almost before the outbreak of war in England that my parents decided that they were leaving England, and they were sure we would be all right. I couldn't have been more than about 18.
And your sisters?
2 years apart, older, but both already ill. My oldest sister had developed tuberculosis for the second time on that concert tour, which was so strenuous for us. My middle sister developed mental problems, and my parents left. My oldest sister recovered enough, met the person that she eventually married, and left for California. So I was left there with my middle sister, who was older than I, but she was already showing signs of illness. And I had no experience of handling anything on my own, but I knew that we had to somehow get back to Canada. I just felt I wanted to get back to my home country. We tried very hard to get passage on the Athenia, which was torpedoed and went down. And they said, no, there's no room on the Athenia, but we can book you a couple of weeks later. So we went on the Duchess of Athol. We arrived in Halifax, and I then had to find out what it was like to stand on my own feet. I had no career. I had nothing. We came to Toronto. I didn't know where to go and live, and we went to the YWCA on Elm Street. I will never forget those lovely people in that Y. If I had a little concert to do somewhere, how they would advance the fare for the train so I could go and do it. But they said to me, I'll never forget this, you know, it's not possible for you to practice in your bedroom, but you could go down to the boiler room and practice in the boiler room. So every morning I went down to the boiler room, and it became very warm by that time. It was April or May, and I used to practice with the window open. It was a huge window. And one day I looked up, and there were 10 faces peering at me through the window. And it was the CBC orchestra rehearsing next door in the church. And they had a break, and they came out, and they heard the cello. So they came to see who it was playing. And because of them, they made me play for anybody of note who came to Toronto. And I remember Arthur Fiedler arrived to do a performance. And I played for Arthur Fiedler, and he immediately invited me to come and be his soloist at the Pops, the Boston Pops, which I did. While I was there, Charles Munch heard me, who was their regular conductor, and he immediately invited me to come and play with the Boston Symphony the next year. But when that came about, Charles Munch had a heart attack, was not able to conduct, so they invited Ernest Ansermet from Geneva, who was the conductor of l'Orchestre de la Suisse Romande. And it was because of Ansermet and our performance together that he invited me to Geneva. And so I started my career in Europe.
That European career wouldn't really take off until after the war. Meanwhile, the sisters still had to eat.
I was very anxious. Naturally, I had to support myself and my sister, but I had no real career going. And Sir Ernest Macmillan heard me. He was conductor of the Toronto Symphony and asked me to come and be his first cellist of the symphony. I had never played in an orchestra in my life. And there I was, first cellist with no experience, and making terrible boo-boos the first season because I was not sure, but his patience was enormous. He was an excellent musician, and I learned a great deal from him. And at that time, the famous Kathleen Parlow, the violinist, came back to Canada after a world career. And she settled in Toronto. And we formed a trio with Sir Ernest, myself, and Kathleen Parlow. And we became known, which was the name that I had with my sisters, as the Canadian Trio.
Zara was 22 years old when she joined the Toronto Symphony. By now, she was going by the name Nelsova. She was an assured player with a virtuosic technique, but she was still growing up as an artist and as a woman. To her later regret, she agreed to marry her stand partner, cellist Philip Spivak. The marriage wouldn't last. While she may have been unlucky in love, she displayed superb taste in picking her teachers. 3 of the century's greatest cellists came into her life, each at just the right time. The last, Pablo Casals, sent a fully formed artist into the world.
You see, they were all 3 so different. Piatigorsky, Feuermann, and Casals. You can't compare them. Besides, they all came into my life at different periods. Piatigorsky came on the scene when I was living in London growing up. And everybody had a crush on Piatigorsky. Oh, he was gorgeous, but he was the most beautiful player. His sound, I don't think could be matched by anybody. And so I arranged to go and study with him when he was teaching at Tanglewood one summer. And then the next summer I went to Rockport, Maine. And I remember our lessons took place in a garage, which was part of the house. We were not working in the house. He didn't have, I don't think he had more than about 2 or 3 students. And I remember the thrill of going through much repertoire with him. And one of the most important with him was the Don Quixote of Strauss, which he told me, actually worked with Strauss. It must have been when he was very young in Germany. You asked me what inspired me about Feuermann. Oh, it was the most gorgeous cello playing I had ever heard. There was such an ease, effortless playing, but extremely musical. And I did go finally to study with him, but only had a very short time with him because then he died. I was still married to Philip. And he was driving me back after a rehearsal of some kind, and he told me that he had just heard that Feuermann had died. And I absolutely broke up completely. It was such a shock. I think Feuermann died in May of 42, and I was due to go back to him in the summer. And then he died. And then I was lost. I didn't want to work anymore with Piatigorsky. I wanted to get to Casals. I wrote to him from London. I was in London. And I was at that time very friendly with the sister of William Primrose, Jean Primrose, who was an artist and became very great friends. And we went together to Prague. I was there 6 weeks, so every time I came, it was a different concerto and a different work. And then I said to him, you know, I would love to work on the Bach Sixth Suite with you. I had worked on the Bach in Toronto before I went to him, and I had observed every little nuance on that recording. When I played it for him in his the house of the concierge, where he used to live in Prague, he nearly threw me out. He said, why are you exaggerating so much? Why are you? I couldn't tell him, Maestro, it's because what you did on your record. But then he sat down and played for me, and there was none of this exaggeration in his playing, because he was a very nervous recording artist. And sometimes he did things on his records which he never did in person. And he sat down and played that suite to me, unbelievably beautiful, with no exaggerations. And that's why I get angry when some student will say, well, I heard such and such a piece of Casals, but I said, you don't know how to listen to him. You don't know what to listen for. He taught me to be myself. the day after a lesson, I couldn't go near my cello. There were too many different ideas, musical ideas. And I would go walking to a deserted village up a mountain, I remember. It would take me about 3-4 hours to get there. And I would sit there, and then when I was ready, I would come back again. And the next morning, I would take my cello and start to practice. But he taught me so much about music, the simplicity.
Nelsova came to work with Casals towards the end of 1947. He was living in Prades, in the south of France, in self-imposed exile from the Franco regime. He'd withdrawn himself from playing and conducting since fleeing Spain in 1936. Casals had only just begun to teach. He insisted on a fanatical level of work and devotion. He took very few pupils, and Zara Nelsova was among the first. Not long after her stay with Casals, a friend arranged for Nelsova to study the cello works of Ernest Bloch with the composer. Bloch was Swiss, but had settled in America for good at the outbreak of the Second World War. He expressed his Jewishness in several works on Hebraic themes, most notably the Israel Symphony and Shlomo, a Hebrew rhapsody for cello and orchestra. When Nelsova came to him, Bloch was teaching at the University of California at Berkeley, but he spent as much time as he could at his seaside home at Agate Beach in Oregon.
He had a garage, and downstairs he had his equipment for polishing agates. That was his great hobby. He used to go out on the beach and collect agates, and then he would come and polish them. Upstairs in this garage, he created a sort of flat for visitors, and that's where I stayed. And many times when I was practicing, I would suddenly hear stomp, 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 Bloch coming up the steps, and he would appear where I was sitting and practicing in his big, tall rubber boots, hip boots, because he'd been out on the beach collecting agates, and his little berry on his head. He said, no, 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 not like this, like this. And he would sit down at the piano, and we would start to work.
They worked on Bloch's compositions, especially Shlomo. Bloch was so impressed with Nelsova's playing, he chose her to be soloist in a performance of Shlomo during a festival in London devoted to his work. That same year, 1949, she recorded Shlomo with the composer conducting.
I had letters from him in which he commented on the playbacks before the first recording was issued. And then he felt that he was pushing too much. Some of it I felt when I listened was a little too fast. He was so afraid that the work would be performed and would sound sentimental, which it isn't. He used to say, don't forget this is a rhapsody, but not a romance. I'm Jewish, but I don't feel particularly Jewish. When I play that work, I don't feel I'm expressing the Jewish spirit. I feel I'm expressing the spirit of mankind, not specifically Jewish. How can I express it? I cannot say that I feel particularly Jewish when I play Cello. It's nothing to do with it. And I suppose I'm like that in a way. I don't have to go to temple to pray. I pray anyway. So I'm a curious mixture. I haven't figured myself out, except that I know that if I can listen to myself, I will never go wrong. And that's very difficult to do for most people. They don't know how to wait for the answer. They're impatient. They do things and then they find it's the wrong time, it's the wrong way, it's all wrong. But if you know how to wait and wait, then that answer always comes, and very often my answer comes while I'm playing, because my mind is still.
In the early 50s, she was invited to play at a dinner party for the great German conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler.
He was sitting at the other end of the room. I'll never forget that. And I started to play, and as usual, with my eyes closed. And I have a piece of Emanuel Moore called Prelude. And I played that. And when I opened my eyes, he had moved from his corner of the room and was sitting next to me. And he became very complimentary. And he said, in his broken English, "You are a very strong player." I said, "Yes, and you know why I'm a strong player? Because I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat meat." And he looked down at me from his great height. I'll never forget this. And I was wearing rather a tight sweater. And he said, "I can see you look wonderful on vegetarian diet. I would like to bring you to play Dvorak with me with the Berlin Philharmonic." And I thought, how wonderful. I had never played with the Berlin Philharmonic at that time. And I said, well, that would be marvelous. And he took my hand. He said, "So you are vegetarian?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You must prepare for me a meal." And I thought, this is going too fast. So I said, "You know, there's a wonderful restaurant here in London. It's called Vega." I said, "Cripps goes there." He drops my hand like a red-hot brick. "Cripps?" I said, "Yes, Sir Stafford Cripps." "Oh," he said as he took my hand back, "I thought you meant Joseph Cripps."
Nelsova is telling a musician's joke. You don't have to know who Sir Stafford Cripps was, only that the rivalry between Furtwängler and fellow conductor Joseph Cripps was legendary. Nelsova did get to play the Dvořák Concerto with the Berlin Philharmonic, but by that time, Furtwängler had died. The early 50s were the golden years of Zara Nelsova's European career. She introduced British audiences to works that have become staples of the modern repertoire, sonatas by Shostakovich and Hindemith, and the cello concerto of Samuel Barber, another work she recorded with the composer conducting. In 1953, in response to hassles from U.S. immigration while on a West Coast tour, Nelsova took up American citizenship. In 1954, she spent 2 months performing in Israel, then a month playing through Alaska and the Northwest Territories. That summer, she came to Stratford, Ontario, to play chamber music with 21-year-old Glenn Gould.
Well, it was before Glenn really made his career. And Sasha Schneider, Alexander Schneider, was the violinist there. He said, we're going to do the Beethoven Ghost Trio, the D major, with Glenn Gould. Hardly knew who Glenn Gould was. And I'll never forget, he arrived for our rehearsal with the usual long scarf draped around his neck and the gloves and all that. And we had a difficult rehearsal because Glenn insisted on his tempi. And Sasha lost his temper at one time and said, I have played this trio hundreds and hundreds of times, and Zara has played this trio hundreds and hundreds of times. Glenn, how many times have you played this trio? Well, this is the first time.
The recordings Nelsova made in the 50s, 60s, and 70s have stood the test of time. Her Bloch discography is definitive. She recorded Shlomo 3 times. She also recorded the Barber, Lalo, Saint-Saëns, and Dvořák concertos, and several recital programs with her second husband, the American pianist, Grant Johannesson. From 1960 on, all of Nelsova's recordings were made on a magnificent Stradivarius cello from 1726. Audrey Melville was the amateur cellist and wealthy committee woman who'd come to Zara's aid when the family first moved to London. For years, she watched Zara struggle with an instrument that wasn't quite the match for her talent. Melville decided to help Nelsova once again. Though she had already decided to leave her Strad to the Royal Academy, Melville changed her will. While she lived, she never breathed a word of this to Nelsova, but she'd attached a letter to her will. Nelsova received it a week after Audrey Melville's death in 1960.
Let's see, April the 15th, 1953. Dearest Zara, I have for some time been thinking a great deal about what is to happen to my cello after my death. Ever since we made friends, I have felt I would like you to have it, and I know if you get to know it, you would love it as much as I do and as my darling Suja did. So, Zara, I have decided to leave it to you for your life, or for as long as you are able to play. His name is Anthony, the cello. My love, goodbye from Audrey. I think I got this letter in 1960. All those years, she never let on. She never let on. But I don't feel that anything really belongs to me. Everything we have is on loan. That's the way I feel. And so when I go to the Royal Academy, and I go now regularly to give master classes, I say to the principal, where shall I leave our cello?
Nelsova has been on the faculty of the Juilliard School since 1985. She's also a professor at Rutgers University and gives master classes the world over. Her classic performances are increasingly becoming available on CD, and she continues to perform from her home base overlooking Central Park in Manhattan. She is one of cello history's great virtuosos, solidly in the tradition of her masters, Casals, Feuermann, and Piatigorsky. She's imbued everything she's done with character and nobility. Hers is a rare gift, but she's given back as much as she got. And when she shares her knowledge with her pupils, they pay attention.
They can't take every little discouragement or setback as something that destroys them. They have to be so strong, it's like a mother protecting an unborn baby. You protect that which is within you. That's the way I feel. They have to become like a fortress. No matter what is thrown at you, it doesn't penetrate. I could never have gone through my career if I wasn't aware of that. I would have folded a long time ago. I always feel that living is like, you remember that game we used to play as youngsters. Maybe you didn't. It was called dodgeball. So that somebody stood in the middle, and then there were two players on either side, and the game was that you had to try to hit the person with the ball in the middle, and if you did, they were out. And life to me is dodging that football.